Chapter 115. Dismissed. My brother's face was being plastered all over the news every day for the past few months as a wanted man. Rat inmates and cops were calling the FBI to tell them that he was in DC jail, thinking I was him. They were all clamoring for the reward money. I ended up with my third assault after an officer came to my cell in a hole and jokingly asked if I would help him capture my brother, he would split the reward money with me. I told him, only thing I could help you with is an early grave. Then I hawk spit in his face. Weeks later, I met with my lawyer. I didn't trust lawyers because of my prior experiences and understanding of their unwritten rule. Meet 'em and plead 'em. But this lawyer was willing to fight. I went to court for the murders and all of a sudden the government withdrew prosecution on the 92 murder, then dismissed the 93 one. I had the perfect alibi. I was in prison. It was virtually impossible for me to have committed those crimes. I immediately began drawing motions for civil suits. After the murder charges were dismissed, a detainer was lodged against me from the parole board. I had to appear before them for violating my parole. The violation? Failure to report to my parole officer that I had been arrested. I was 23 years old. The parole hearing was like a trial. Lawyers and character witnesses for the defense. Homicide detectives and FBI agents for the government. An orange-skinned, sunburned agent testified that I was innocent of the murders, but they believed I knew about them, even though I was in prison. So they knew I was innocent, yet they still charged me to use it as leverage to remove me from society. What if I was a timid individual and implicated myself on those murders, then pled guilty to those murders out of fear? I would have been sentenced to 60 years for something they all knew I didn't do. This happened to innocent people all the time, and it was a clear look into the so-called justice system. They testified that I knew of my brother's whereabouts and that he was wanted by the FBI and Interpol. They also brought up Benny's name in the First and Kennedy Street notoriety. They told the parole examiner that I, along with my brother, were leaders of the notorious gang and under investigation for racketeering and conspiracy, 18 murders including the killings of FBI agents, hundreds of pounds of marijuana, and dozens of kilos of cocaine. My defense was irrelevant. My lawyer was nervous and intimidated by the FBI insignias, and the parole board wasn't interested in whatever she had to say. Even with all the speculation, I was still only facing 6 months for the failure to report my arrest to my parole officer, which I couldn't do anyway because I was in jail. As I stepped out of the parole hearing with my paranoid lawyer, the agent stayed in the room with the examiner. The recording device was turned off as we were leaving. They were obviously whispering sweet nothings in his ear. These were the same agents that interrogated me in the homicide headquarters. One of them was the same one that sat in the corner and cried like a baby. Bitch ass. My jail conduct wasn't brought into the hearing because my counselor kept stalling on sending it to the parole board before the hearing. She knew I was being railroaded and should have been released after the murders were dismissed. In protest, I burned my cell, causing thick black smoke to smother the cell block, which it had to be evacuated. I filed lawsuits against the head of the parole examiner, the commissioner, all in their individual capacities. I filed a writ of habeas corpus demanding immediate release, and I filed lawsuits against the FBI agents for false arrests. No one paid me any attention. Chapter 117. Death Battle. After a month in the hole, I observed two men arguing through the cell doors about what was considered snitching and what wasn't. The premise was, if a civilian snitched, they shouldn't be held accountable because they aren't held under the same rules as gangsters. But one guy said he would kill the civilian also because his freedom was on the line. The other guy was offended because his mother was forced to testify against him after a murder weapon was found in her home. And he said he would kill anyone who called her a snitch or attempted to harm her, even though her testimony may put him away for life. She was a civilian and had no choice but to testify that the weapon belonged to him, or she would be charged with accessory to murder and possession of a weapon which she never even possessed. It was his mistake. The weapon shouldn't have never ended up in his mother's home for the cops to find it in the first place. So essentially, he was correct. The first guy said he would kill her and think nothing of it. He had a racketeering charge that included no drugs, just all kidnappings, robberies, and murders. He was facing 10 life sentences plus 189 years. The argument led to threats and bar fighting. The next morning, the one facing the 10 life sentences was let out of his cell for his 1-hour recreation and asked an officer if he could let the other guy out to rec with him. They were cousins, he said. The officer asked the other guy and he affirmed that they were indeed cousins, which they weren't. The officer signaled to a second officer in the bubble to pop his cell and then returned back to the bubble himself. They both came out of their cells with extra clothing, 2 thick blue jumpsuits, a towel around their neck and head, and they immediately headed for the gym, then closed the door behind them. Soon as the door closed, they attacked each other full force. They both had knives and were stabbing each other for like 5 minutes straight. The officer came out the bubble and went to the gym to check on them after he heard a scream. When he opened the door, they were playing basketball. They were so adamant about killing each other that when they heard the officer coming, they even wiped the blood off of the gym floor and stayed far from him so he couldn't see the blood marks on their clothes while dribbling the ball and checking each other. 10 life sentences went up for a layup and bent over gasping for air. The officer thought he was tired, but his lungs was on the verge of collapse. He then closed the door and left them to continue playing basketball with swords. They immediately began stabbing each other again. After another 10 minutes, the one whose mother was testifying against him walked out first. He was bloody and walking slow. He lost an ear and his neck was leaking. The one facing the 10 lives came out a couple minutes later covered in blood and collapsed by the steps. He had a punctured lung and a collapsed liver. They were both transferred to the hospital, then returned back to the same cell block a week later to brag about who really won the brutal contest of death. No one was charged because they refused to testify or make any statements against each other. In effect, concluding their argument about what a snitch is or isn't. I was ironically at peace in the hole. I hadn't been outside of the 6-foot by 8-foot cell with no windows in months. I was still being held hostage. The FBI or any of the other government officials hasn't bothered me in months. They had me where they wanted, in their confines. My charges were dismissed over 6 months ago and the parole board hadn't made any decision yet. They were holding their decision based on my brother's eluding or capture. I was only facing 6 months, which I had already served, plus some, so they would have to give me immediate release. My freedom was a speculation, and my life was in limbo in the midst of an international political chess game. The Interpol, which is international police, officers in Rome, Italy had took control of the search for my brother. And I was ordered to be held in jail by those same officials, 4,500 miles away. The Jamaican police, along with police forces in Moscow, Russia, Cairo, Egypt, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and Nairobi, Kenya were all on alert in search of my identical twin brother, and I was informed that I would complicate their efforts with my release. Then the FBI began focusing their attention on my mom because of her vast connections across the globe. I was even told by my lawyer that he overheard that if I was released, they would arrest her and I would probably be killed immediately. He said he would be surprised if I made it out of the jail parking lot. After all, we were identical twins. Killing me would be easily justified. Then it got worse. 3 money orders sent to me from Colombia were intercepted, starting another investigation. The FBI had legal attaché offices with over 115 senior agents and support personnel in 23 nations around the world, including Cairo, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh. They were the conduit through which law enforcement information and cooperation flowed between the U.S. and its foreign partners. They were stationed overseas to fight organized crime, terrorism, nuclear smuggling, drug trafficking, violent and economic crime. The House of Representatives held a hearing on the threat of Russian organized crime, where my brother's name was constantly mentioned. FBI agents in Rome had recently conducted a joint 18-month investigation into a Colombian, Italian, US-based drug gang that resulted in 80 arrests for drug trafficking. Next, they arrested one of the most powerful Russian crime leaders. And now their focus was on my brother. Because of the FBI's relationship with the MVD in Russia through the legal attaché program, they were now tracing Aeroflot records in search of him. This was the same program that worked with Kazakhstan and was responsible for the seizure by Russian customs of 1.1 tons of pure cocaine. This program also captured Ehad Ismail in Jordan on an indictment charging him with taking part in the bombing of the World Trade Center that killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 in 1993. It also captured Ramzi Youssef and Abdul Hakim Murad for bombing a U.S. commercial airline that killed 1 passenger. Youssef was also facing charges relating to the bombing of the World Trade Center. Him and Murad was captured in Pakistan. Even with these successes, we were still rooting for my brother. If he can get to Rwanda or Ethiopia, he would be safe.